Well, good afternoon to everybody on this spectacularly beautiful day in New Jersey. The sun is shining, it's crisp and lovely, and I hope that your hearts are full of the brightness of the day to counteract much of what we have had, what we do have now, and what we have had going on. I'd like to open the meeting first, our afternoon first, with a moment of silence in remembrance of George Floyd, but not only George Floyd, obviously, but all of those who have perished and have suffered under the years of brutality that Mr. Floyd experienced and so many others. Their names should be remembered. There are so many that we cannot remember them all today. And so I am going to now thank you. Thank you. We have them in front of you. And as we have this 1 minute, a full minute of silence, please do read the names and send your love to them with your thoughts. We're starting now. Thank you. Technology being what it is, I don't know how to turn this thing off. I'm sorry. Thank you. Welcome for our annual membership gathering, our sponsors gathering. We met with Professor Chomsky on Thursday. Some of you were there. Many of you are here again today. And I really want to thank especially to all of you, our loyal and ever-present members and friends who support our work and who give us the feeling that we need to have the support that we need from you every single day to accomplish our work. Thank you to our executive director, Bob Moore, who leads us together with Nikki Van Aller, our assistant director, in these most difficult times. It is especially important that Bob and Nikki have the presence to keep us going, and all of the board members who are here today, and all of you together. Without this combined force, we cannot do what we have to do. You take action every day by being present. Even if you're not physically able to, and we are not physically able to do as much as we wish in person, you've been phenomenal in getting things done from the sidelines through these kinds of meetings as we're having today. We're at a very, very important crossroads in human history. And we share a common global battle against a scourge of this pandemic. But we also, here in the United States, have an imperative. And our imperative, as at no other time, is to reclaim our moral compass. And we reclaim it in this year, as Noam Chomsky has called on us to do, is to vote for Joseph Biden. It's a clear statement on my personal part. I'm sorry if that's not, it is too important for us not to make that statement today. Going into this gathering today, we have serious and discussions. We have joyful discussions. We have spectacular honorees. And I do want to say thank you to our sponsors who have supported this particular June gathering, as many of you do every year. And I think that Nikki might have a chance to share on the screen the names of the sponsors of our gathering, and take a look at all of the lovely names of those who are supporting us. And I welcome you all again. I'm delighted to see that Professor Klare is here and present with us, as well as our wonderful honorees, Danielle Allura and Carol Haig. So without further ado, I pass the baton off to Bob, who will speak next. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for your continued support, and stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, and it's great to have you as our board chair these last 15 years, by the way, and of course a leader and heavily involved much longer than that. So we're honored to have your leadership. This is our 40th anniversary membership gathering. We were founded in 1980. And it's been a great blessing for me to have been the executive director of the Coalition for Peace Action for 39 of those 40 years. This annual membership gathering is usually preceded by an in-person reception and dinner. It's been a major event for most of those 40 years, but this year is different. We're gathering virtually for the first time out of necessity today. So while I'm proud of our accomplishments, and Nikki, if you could put those on the screen now, the pandemic has brought some special new challenges which we continue to face going forward. I always like to start with these highlights of accomplishments, and I want to underline that they're not the accomplishments of any one person. They're the accomplishments of all of us working together. One of my favorite mantras that I am very mindful of and focused on as I've gone through these 39 years with you is that peace is a team effort, and none of it does it alone. So we have had great accomplishments through the past year, from April of 2019 to April of 2020, as you can see on your screen. And I want to call attention especially to the last two, because it's been a great challenge just in the last two bullet points, especially in this time of pandemic. It's been a great challenge of how do we adapt? How do we keep our work going vigorously and strongly? And so the second to the last item is about our Peace Voter 2020 campaign and the great start that we've already made for it this year. We've done 3 candidate briefings, and by the way, I'm proud that the Coalition for Peace Action pioneered these in 2000, the year 2000, 20 years ago. But the overall Peace Voter campaign, we pioneered in 1995, so 25 years ago. We've already done 3 candidate briefings with major party candidates, with our organizational leaders and top experts that we have access to on our issues. Only the first candidate briefing was able to be done in person in early March, because after that, the next 2, by then, we were hitting the beginning of the pandemic, or at least our awareness of how dangerous a time it was. So the second 2 were virtual briefings, and all 3, I'm pleased to say, were also not only had the briefing and spent 90 minutes with us in that briefing, but all 3 of them also responded to our candidate questionnaire to make clear what their positions were on our issues. And secondly, you can see there that we also have done a virtual lobby day on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and that's where we initially encountered Danielle, and I know we'll hear more about her as one of our honorees in just a little while. That virtual organizing has continued very successfully and very strongly. I'll just give you an example. Already this month, we have been part of and the leaders of 5 virtual lobby appointments with our key elected officials from New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And so we have really taken the bull by the horns with great support from Nikki, especially on things like this and social media. Nikki is our sort of point person. And so we're grateful for Nikki's leadership on this area of our work too. So, you know, let's give ourselves a little bit of applause, virtual applause, for these great accomplishments. And as we do that applause, Nikki, can you take the highlights off the screen share? Now I want to, and let's applause. I know we can't necessarily see all of you, but we know we're all applauding because these are really important, and our really our stick-to-itiveness, our tenaciousness is really one of the hallmarks of how we make continuous progress. So I want to just review 3 challenges ahead of us. First and foremost is Peace Voter 2020. As I told you in reviewing our accomplishments so far, we've already made a very good start during the primary season. But I want to give you a little bit of a preview of the close races that are in New Jersey that we'll be focusing on as we get into the general election season after our primary in New Jersey. Pennsylvania's already had theirs. Our primary in New Jersey will be taking place on July 7th. So once we move past that original phase, there are 3 priority races in New Jersey that we'll be targeting for our Peace Voter campaign. They're all extremely important. The first one is going to be Tom Malinowski in District 7, just above Princeton. He is being challenged by State Senator Tom Kean Jr., the son of the former governor. So he has a strong challenger. He has been very engaged with us. He even spoke when he only was representative-elect. He spoke for our holiday gathering, the December after he was first elected, but it was not a runaway. It was a close race, and we expect it will again be close. Second one was the closest race in New Jersey. In fact, it was so close they couldn't declare a winner until they allowed some days after the election to finish counting the absentee ballots, and that was Andy Kim. He won by the narrowest margin of any U.S. representative from New Jersey. And third, Jeff Van Drew in the 2nd district. Now, Jeff was a Democrat, a so-called moderate Democrat when he ran and was first elected. As you know, he's now become a Trump Republican. So 2 of the 3 candidate briefings that we did in the primaries were with the 2 top candidates to oppose him in the Democratic primary. Both women, by the way, both very sharp. So we expect to also do, in addition to those 3 races in New Jersey as targets, we will be targeting the state of Pennsylvania. And you all know, of course, that a big part of Trump's victory was narrow victories, very, very narrow, razor-thin victories in a half dozen states, and Pennsylvania was one of those. So we intend to mount a vigorous effort in Pennsylvania as well. Those are the challenges under the Peace Voter. Then the second challenge that I want to mention is that we need to push back as strongly as possible against Donald Trump's wrecking ball approach to the arms control treaties and agreements that many of us have been working for a long time and were very, very important gains. Donald Trump has now withdrawn from 3 of those major treaties. The first one was the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. which was the first great accomplishment after the huge nuclear freeze campaign. And President Reagan was forced back to the negotiating table. And while he was at the negotiating table, a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the former Soviet Union. And the proposal that that Reagan had put on the table for a 0-0 option, which had been rejected, understandably, by the Soviets because they already had hundreds of medium-range nuclear weapons deployed. The US had none when that proposal was made. And so it was a very one-sided proposal. But surprisingly, after Gorbachev came to power, he accepted that offer. And so we had the first nuclear reduction treaty in history in 1987, eliminating over 2,000 nuclear weapons of the medium-range category. Trump withdrew from that treaty. Then the second agreement, really, it wasn't really codified into a treaty, but it had the weight of a treaty, was the Iran nuclear agreement, which was a multilateral agreement. You all remember this. We worked very hard for it. It took 2 long years to negotiate. It was very meticulous, highly verifiable. And the end result is that in return for some targeted lifting of sanctions, Iran agreed to restrain its nuclear weapons capability, and particularly the amount of nuclear weapons material it had went down to 0. And so a lot of its highly enriched uranium, a lot of its materials that could be turned into a bomb were shipped out of the country into Russia, and other parts were agreed so that until this treaty was withdrawn from, Iran was at least a year away from having enough nuclear weapons material to build a bomb. It's now nearly a year since President Trump withdrew. And interestingly, in that year, Iran has accumulated enough nuclear weapons material to have a single bomb starting next month, exactly a year after. So in fact, the treaty was working. It was keeping Iran away for at least a year, but now Trump has withdrawn from that. And then most recently, the latter part of May, Trump withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty. Now this treaty was very, very hopeful, and I want to just spend a minute explaining it because it gave transparency and confidence building to both sides. So all of the parties to this treaty were allowed to fly aircraft over the other territory of the adversary to see what was happening with their military assets. And what this does is it gives confidence to each side that there's not going to be any surprise attack. There's not going to be anything that they don't know about and aren't expecting. Well, Trump also has withdrawn from that. So we are working intensively and need to continue to do so. I have an op-ed on our website under Take Action. I hope you'll take a look at that. It has a lot more detail. But more importantly, it also gives an immediate handle that we can use to push back. We're still developing more. But this pattern of the wrecking ball approach is also putting the New START treaty in danger. It expires next February. It can be extended for another 5 years simply by the agreement of the 2 chief executives of the US and Russia. Putin says he's ready to extend it. It's a verifiable treaty. It keeps our nuclear weapons under control and at lower numbers. Trump is saying he's resisted even starting talks. He's now saying, I'll start talks, but only if China also comes to the table, which is totally a poison pill. And China's a tiny nuclear weapon state compared to the US and Russia. So we can't be cynical or defeatist about these outrages. We've got to be really intense and stubborn and persistent. And so we are already working with our congressional delegation. Some of those 5 appointments we've already had earlier this month are in that category. We've discussed these issues, and they're ready to help us. Remember, Congress holds the purse strings. And so if money is not allocated to implement these things that Trump wants to do with his wrecking ball approach, then things can't happen. Third and finally, so here's my 3-point sermon, the third point. Third and finally, we need to continue to deepen our intersectional work. We've already been linking with the No Wars, No Warming campaign, linking to the climate crisis, as many of you know. And I'm very proud of that. Again, the coalition, your Coalition for Peace Action, has been a pioneer in that. We initiated this campaign in 2014 with the first People's Climate March, and is still going 6 years later, still going strong, in fact. And we did these webinars on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, as I mentioned, and Ed will be presenting an honor to Danielle in just a little while on that. But secondly, we've also been intersectional with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I feel very encouraged and very hopeful about that movement. We already co-sponsored a Princeton Rally just a few days after George Floyd's murder. And it was dumbfounding, the number of people who came. They had to shut down a large part of Nassau Street, I'd say 4 blocks of Nassau Street and the whole first long block of Witherspoon, so that the attendance was in the thousands. So we were just proud. It was a very diverse crowd, age diverse, race diverse, every other category. And tonight, this very night at 7:30 in Cranberry, I hope you can join us for a Black Lives Matter Candlelight Vigil. One of the things I'm most excited about in this intersectional organizing is that a major role has been played, leadership role has been played by young women. And that was true of the rally that we had in Princeton, but it's also true of the rally happening tonight. It was initiated by a high school junior who lives in Cranberry. So I hope you'll be able to join us. We will continue in this intersectional organizing. It's a way that we relate to important issues that intersect with our issues and important constituencies as well. I encourage you to be involved in the Coalition for Peace Action's work as a volunteer. Usually we have a piece of paper you can hand in to become a volunteer, but we don't today. So I encourage you to go to our website, peacecoalition.org, and there's 2 buttons at the top right. The second button from the right is our volunteer button. It allows you to volunteer to be active on one of our committees or in a number of other ways. So I encourage you, if you're saying, I'd like to be actively involved with my own skills, my own passion, that would be great. Please fill out that form and email it to us. But the other way you can support us is with your generous financial support. And for that, you're going to use the button at the top right of peacecoalition.org. And having said that, I'm going to now introduce, to give us a little pitch on that, the Reverend Carol Haig. Carol.
Thank you, Bob. During part 1 of this Coalition for Peace Action annual meeting on Wednesday, Noam Chomsky laid out 3 imminent threats to our life as humans on this planet. Sorry, there's something in front of me that I don't understand. So Noam Chomsky said these 3 major threats. First, nuclear war. The doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists stands at 100 seconds before midnight. That's 100 seconds to nuclear holocaust. The second major threat is the environmental catastrophe. We are assured that if we humans continue to warm the globe by burning fossil fuels, this catastrophe is inevitable. And third, the deterioration of democracy. In this country and across the globe, autocracy and plutocracy are growing apace. Then we add to this a second terrible trilogy: massive economic inequality, horrific racial injustice, and the coronavirus pandemic. It feels overwhelming. And the Coalition for Peace Action cannot make it all right. However, this organization makes a difference in the three major threats named above. One, and Bob described the process, the activities that are coming. These activities are made possible by your support. One, educating legislators and leaders about the insanity of, quote, modernizing, meaning expanding our nuclear weapons. Two, partnering with environmental organizations to end global warming. And three, ongoing efforts to preserve the security of our voting, our democracy. Today, as we celebrate the important work of the coalition, we come to you, its most dedicated and loyal followers and supporters. Because the need is so great, Jane and George Shildage and Irene Goldman have together pledged $2,500 in matching funds if you can raise $2,500 today. Every gift will be doubled. If you give $5, it'll be 10. If you give 100, it'll be 200. If you give 500, it'll be 1,000. If you already pledge and give to the coalition, please add a special gift today. Carl and I regularly give $1,000 to the coalition, and here is our check for $100, a 10% increase. Our country, our planet, our humanity requires our generosity today. Now, music will play while you give you time to go to the website, peacecoalition.org. Bob just gave you the directions. There's a box up on the right-hand side, and you can check that. And if you, like I, are old-fashioned, you can write a check and mail it to the coalition at 40 Witherspoon Street in Princeton. Thank you for your generosity. We've got a wonderful screen thing on it, the $2,500 match. All we need is 25 people to give $100. We've got it.
I don't the music particularly.
Okay.
Oh, I was thinking about your us here.
I hope someday you join us and the world will be one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed, no hunger. A brother of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You
Thanks, Carol. So next up, we're going to do some presentations of awards, and I think I'm handing it over to Ed Aguilar.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So, hi, everybody. I'm Ed Aguilar. Most of you know me. I'm the director in Pennsylvania at the Philadelphia office for the Coalition for Peace Action. Pardon my shaggy hair. I haven't been able to get to the barber in about 6 weeks. I'm very happy to be here to present our first certificate of recognition today. And I'm proud and excited to say that the person we're awarding this to is a young person, a very special young person, and that's Danielle Allura Mignona. Danielle began her public service at the young age of 14, volunteering for a national nonprofit called Families Promise. She was in Delaware at the time. Families Promise works with homeless people, including families, and they have a 90% success rate in bringing homeless people and families into stable homes, often within 3 or 4 months. That is a wonderful track record. Currently, Danielle, who has also lived in California, though she's now in Pennsylvania, she's moved around, but she's still the vice president of the Orange County chapter in Southern California, even though she's here on the East Coast. And here is Danielle on the screen. She has, welcome Danielle. She has helped to double that organization's fundraising, if I'm correct. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So we will, we'll ask Danielle herself to tell us about her record on that front, but there's more. This year, Danielle was chosen as Miss Elite Pennsylvania, as you see on the screen, in this year's Miss Earth competition, which I'm just learning about. So Miss Earth works with the UNEP, that's the UN Environmental Program, as well as the Miss Earth Foundation, to promote the idea of, quote, environmental peace building, and to examine and advocate environmental protection and cooperation as a factor in creating more peaceful relations. So Danielle's work with this foundation and with the competition for Miss Earth is actually doing very similar work for sustainable development and for peace as what we do here at the Coalition. So it should not be surprising to anyone that this spring, Danielle has joined the Coalition for Peace Action. So welcome and thanks for joining us. She's also joined, and I want to welcome her too because I'm a member of that organization. Danielle has joined the event committee at the UN Association of Greater Philadelphia. So welcome again. So as you can see, Danielle is a very active and committed young person. And she is, I'm just skipping ahead a little bit here. We do have some UNA board members here, so we are well represented from that board as well. And so I'm both proud and delighted to present the award that you'll see on the screen in a moment. I believe we'll have that on screen. There it is. And that is, let me just say, with gratitude and admiration for exemplary peace leadership, presented this day, June 14th, 2020, to Danielle Allura by the Coalition for Peace Action. So thank you, Danielle. Welcome, and please say a few words.
Thank you so very much. It's been such an honor being a member of the Coalition for Peace Action, as well as the United Nations of Greater Philadelphia. In case any of you are not familiar with the Coalition for Peace Action, I really do encourage you to not only get active, but also donate. It's a great cause and one that I really look forward to continually being active with to see our impacts in the future. The United Nations Environmental Program focuses on, namely, 17 sustainable goals, also climate change. I encourage you to also do your research on them. I namely like to focus on the ones like clean water and sanitation when it comes to single-use plastics and waste in our environment. The UNAGP and the Coalition for Peace are always looking for volunteers and leaders, so I encourage you to join us and lead with us. I've personally always had a green conscience. I grew up admiring my mother and father, especially on how green conscious they were. My mother especially was very clever and frugal, and being the oldest of 4 adopted kids, our childhood activities encompassed gardens, hand-me-downs, recycling, repurposing things, and we simply just couldn't throw everything away. After traveling 9 countries last summer, no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the fact that I saw litter everywhere. So my platform as Elite Miss Pennsylvania has 2 sides to it. Number 1, it's called No Excuse for Single Use, where I focus on the individual, encouraging people to begin a zero waste home, especially during the pandemic, by encouraging the recapture of water, using it for their plants, beginning a compost, doing a plastic audit throughout their house, regrowing food scraps, and much more. Please check my website for all of these tips and tricks. Going green and making a big impact on climate change is not strictly with the individual, however. 70% of emissions come from corporations. We need the corporations as well to contribute. Otherwise, us as individuals with our proud zero waste homes going green, that won't even make a dent in climate change improvements. So at the other side of my platform, I'm partnering first with the hotel industry for their green improvements. I love to travel, and I was reminded of how wasteful we can be around the world, as well as the hotel industry believing so much in these single-use plastics. I've developed a green program that can improve their carbon footprint and greatly reduce their waste. On June 20th, which is this weekend, my first outdoor event with more than 50 hotels that are interested up and down the East Coast are attending to learn how they can go greener. If you're a hotelier in the East Coast, reach out to me. I'd love to see how I can help you go green while saving you money on your bottom line. Think global, act local is a term we use a lot with the Miss Earth organization. It's important in so many regards. My platform, for example, with the individual and with corporations, if we were to implement my green solutions locally into our communities, and we did this in all communities, we could find the solutions a ripple effect globally. This pandemic has really brought to light the need for us to become more self-sufficient, as our grocery store chains and centralized industrial farms failed us with empty shelves. Fortunately, local farmers and local fresh markets relationships strengthened in our greater Philadelphia area and proved once again that they're tastier, healthier, more sustainable, and the need and love for community is here once again. So let's not forget this as the world starts opening back up. I encourage you all to write your elected officials, become more involved, write your favorite brands and corporations on your opinion, how important it is that they are more green conscious. And remember, there's no excuse for single use. You can find more of my work on facebook.com/Elite Miss Pennsylvania. And I thank you so much to the Coalition for Peace for this award. I look forward to our continued and increased impact that we will make together. So here's to a greener 2020. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Danielle, and that's very impressive. And talk about the leadership of young women. Yours is really very impressive indeed. So we applaud you, and we encourage you to continue your great leadership in this effort. It's now my honor to present our second and final award for this annual membership gathering. And you've already heard from her, the Reverend Carol Haig. One of the biggest challenges for the Coalition for Peace Action, and I think for many, if not most, nonprofits, is raising a budget that is going to be at least remotely adequate. Like most nonprofits, the biggest part of our budget at the Coalition for Peace Action is the generous donations of donors. And we have a cadre of donors who are giving us between $100,000 and $30,000 a year. We need to stay in close touch with them, but also to reapproach them each year with an annual donor drive. One of the earliest pieces of wisdom I learned when I was at a workshop on how to do fundraising was the question, why is it that most people don't give to Peace Action? And the answer was because they aren't asked. So we need to be asking, and doing that correctly with best practices, doing it in a timely way is really essential to the success of our ability to raise our budget. Thankfully, we've been fortunate to have an outstanding volunteer leader of that annual donor drive effort for the past 4 years. And that is the Reverend Carol Haig. Through the end of 2019. Under Carol's leadership, let me just review a few of the great advances we've made because of her outstanding volunteer leadership. First, under Carol's leadership, we've expanded the donor pyramid that is the basis for our annual donor drive. That's what we look at to see where is our money coming from, who gives it. Now, it's a very limited number of people who see this information. It's those of us that are involved as a team of 6 to 8 of us who go over this information and then divide up who is going to approach which donor on that list. So Carol said we should be having all donors, whatever form of giving they give. So we had not been really staying in touch with our pledgers before Carol took over the leadership because they're on automatic pilot. Most of them are giving on their credit card every month or every quarter. But Carol correctly said they need to be part of our donor pyramid so that they're included. We see what their contribution to the goal is and how we can pay attention to them and stay in touch with them. Secondly, Carol has helped establish written materials and online information on our Peace Legacy Giving program. Now, there's 2 ways you can give to the Peace Legacy to help the Coalition for Peace Action have long-term financial stability. One is our Peace Endowment Fund. That was established in 1999 as we were on the verge of entering a new millennium. And it has been very, very successful, but it also has plateaued, quite frankly. It had excitement when we were first starting it up, and it needs to have more attention paid to it. And so Carol helped us develop some nice brochures and a plan for reaching out to our supporters to be supportive of this Peace Endowment Fund for our long-term stability. By the way, one of the rules of that fund, as it is for many endowments, is we only use 5% of it a year. So we keep growing more than that because most of it's invested in a socially responsible mutual fund. And secondly, legacy gifts. This is where you think about your estate planning. And there's a lot of options in it, ranging from bequests to IRAs, having backup beneficiaries of IRAs, and all kinds of things like that. So Carol made a very important contribution toward helping us standardize and improve our messaging around that, including, by the way, when you click on that contribute button at the top right that I mentioned earlier, If you scroll down to the bottom, you will see a description of what I just told you, both of the Peace Endowment Fund and of Giving a Peace Legacy. Third, Carol was instrumental in our beginning to have challenge grants, both for our annual membership renewal gathering and our membership dinner, the one that we're having right now, our annual membership gathering. And that has played a key role in inspiring people to be more generous than they otherwise might be, and to understand that if they give on this special opportunity, that they will have their donation doubled or even tripled. And that does make a very big difference in terms of the motivation. So the income from these two events has gone up dramatically since Carol helped us institute this program. And finally, she has been a thoughtful and inspirational leader in our follow-up with members of the Donor Drive Committee. So as I told you, it's not a large committee, about 8 of us that do this work. But you want to know, what are the best practices? What are the ins and outs of doing this kind of work effectively? And also, inevitably, there are times when we get frustrated or discouraged. Say, I don't know why I can't succeed in raising more money than I thought I was going to raise. Carol has had a wonderful touch in dealing with these kinds of questions and concerns, and really at sharing with us what the best practices are that work most effectively over the long term. So in closing, I'd like to say that 2 pieces of good news about Carol's time over these last 4 years. Since she became the chair of the Donor Drive Committee, each year we have exceeded our budgeted goal of what we wanted to try to raise for our annual donor drive. I think that's just incredible. Some years it was a dramatic amount over what our goal was. One year, I remember our goal was $80,000 and we raised more than $100,000 from our donor drive. But even better, the other piece of good news is that while Carol has stepped aside from her role as the donor drive chair, Michael Robertson, I'm happy to say, has stepped forward to step into her shoes. They're very big shoes. But Carol is remaining on the committee and is part of our annual solicitation effort still. So please join me, and Nikki, maybe you could put up the certificate before Carol makes her response. Yes, so we're giving virtual applause right now to a wonderful leadership job on a very important part of our work from the Reverend Carol Haig. Carol, I think you could say a few words.
Thank you so much, Bob. Honestly, I am awed to be honored along with you, Danielle. That's an awesome, they are awesome projects that you're involved with, and your commitment and determination is just, it's awesome. And I'm honored to be honored by the Coalition for Peace Action Board and staff. I'm even more honored to be recognized by this body of peaceniks. You collectively make all the work for peace of this nationally recognized peace organization possible. A little history. When I heard Dr. Helen Caldicott speak in 1981 or 82 about the imminence of nuclear destruction, that catapulted me into the peace movement. I could see nothing more important as wife and mother and citizen than to do this work. Carl and I joined the Coalition for Peace Action, and I took a job with the Nuclear Dialogue Project that was created right here in Princeton by Rachel Findley. So all told, I think I tallied 5 careers: social worker, mother, scout leader and organizer, peacemaker, and Unitarian Universalist minister. Now, I've settled on my 6th career, which is fundraiser. Throughout all these efforts, I have found both challenge and delight in helping individuals match up their skills and resources with their highest passions. Money is just one of these. Thank you for putting your financial resources in service of our collective passion for peace. Thank you very much.
Beautiful.
I hope they have their speaker.
Right. Thank you, Carol. I'm going to jump in here now and introduce our main speaker. We're happy to have Dr. Michael Klare. He's a writer, teacher, and a public speaker who studies issues of war and peace, resource competition, and international affairs. He's based at Hampshire College, where he teaches courses on resource politics, contemporary conflict, and world affairs. He's written 14 books and hundreds of essays on these and related topics. He also appears regularly in the media and in public to express his views on critical issues. We invited him based on an article in The Nation on the interconnectedness between nuclear weapons and the climate crisis, and we're excited to hear from him on that topic.
Very good. Can you hear me okay? Great, great, great. Well, I'm delighted to be with you on this occasion, 40th anniversary. Wow, that's quite an accomplishment, and congratulations. And to those of you who have just won awards, I'm very impressed at hearing of the achievements of both of those who just received awards. Very, very impressive to listen to that. And I'm pleased to be with you today. So as Nikki just said, I was invited to address this group on the basis of an article I wrote in The Nation magazine at the very beginning of the year on the interconnections between nuclear war and nuclear arms racing and climate change. And I argued in that article that the more we look into the future, the more these two great threats were bending closer together. And before I go further, I should say that I was influenced by your other speaker the other night, Noam Chomsky, who had already put into my head the notion that climate change and nuclear war were the two great threats to human survival in this century. I wanted to show not only that these are great threats, but also that they are bending towards each other and reinforcing each other. And I showed various ways in which this was so in my article. So I very swiftly just want to summarize a few of those points because I want to go on from there. But I argued then, and I continue to do so, that these threats will increasingly merge over time. That I think that climate change will make nuclear arms racing, arms buildup, and nuclear war more likely because it's going to increase the pressures on governments around the world in multiple ways. Governments will come under increasing stress from their populations to cope with the many disasters they're going to face. And in many cases, this is going to lead to more authoritarian governments, and authoritarian governments tend by nature to be highly militaristic governments, to emphasize the armed forces and weapons buildup and, showing muscle all the time and using military force to protect themselves. And this often slides into war, as history shows. And we see this tendency today among the nuclear powers, all of them, United States, Russia, China, India, and Pakistan, all show signs under stresses their society is facing towards authoritarianism and militarism and nuclear weapons buildup. All of these countries are engaged in a nuclear weapons buildup at this time. Climate change is going to influence the likelihood of nuclear war in more specific ways. As warming advances, certain resources are going to become more scarce, especially water. And this will be a source of friction among nuclear-powered states that share water resources. And in particular, I worry about the competition between India and Pakistan for the water of the Indus River, which is the main source of water for Pakistan and the western half of India, and also competition between India and China over the Brahmaputra River, which is a major source of water and electrical power in China, but also a major source of irrigation water for eastern part of India. And as climate change advances, the water supply in both of those rivers is expected to diminish. And there are fears that those countries will seek to dam the rivers for their exclusive use. And that this could, combined with other pressures, lead to greater hostility and friction between them and conceivably nuclear war. I write about this in my book, All Hell Breaking Loose. Hold it up right, if I could do that. All Hell Breaking Loose, about climate change and military. And so that's climate change and nuclear war. The nuclear arms race makes climate change more likely by diverting funds that could be used for addressing the climate crisis and shunting them into military purposes, and also by increasing hostility and suspicion among the major powers, especially the US and China, US and Russia, and India and China, and therefore making it harder to negotiate climate agreements and to cooperation to address the climate threat. And we're seeing that today too. The Department of Defense proposed budget for fiscal year 2021, which was introduced in February, the biggest increase in the defense budget for next year is for nuclear weapons buildup of all, at this time, like we need this insanity. And that money could be used to address all kinds of needs in our society. Now, I could go on about these connections, and please, those of you who are listening, want to pin me down on any of this, I'm happy to address these questions. But since I was invited to speak with you all, we've seen not one, but several additional calamities of more or less equal magnitude, or approaching the magnitude of those two. And several of you have alluded to this already. We've had a pandemic, a global pandemic, unlike anything in any of our lifetimes, and one that's touching the entire world, and is at this moment on a worldwide basis is getting worse, not better. It's beginning to affect large parts of the developing world, where the capacity to deal with it is much lower than it is in our country, and we haven't done so well. So this is a pandemic whose effects are far from seeing the end of it. And we know what an enormous impact it's had. It in turn has created other shock waves, a global economic meltdown, and a global food crisis. And that last part, the global food crisis, may be the worst part of the pandemic, especially in the developing world. And on top of that, we've now had the global response to the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis 3 weeks ago. And that has set off shockwaves of their own. And these are continuing. And they reinforce each other. The economic meltdown created by the pandemic, we discovered, as we've learned, has affected people differently. Those of lower income and minorities have fared less well, for the most part, than white people and wealthier people. And this is certainly contributed to the intensity of the anger that was expressed in Minneapolis and then in many other cities around the United States. So you see how these various crises and calamities interact with one another and reinforce them and create shockwaves. And I don't think we have seen the end of the shockwaves. In fact, I think that we are in a new era in which global shockwaves of this sort are going to be the new normal, or the new abnormal, if you like, where we can expect one shockwave after the other with unforeseeable consequences that shake up all of society and make the dangers of one more and more profound. This is where we're going to be from now on. And they certainly will make nuclear war in all likelihood more likely. Now, we should have seen this coming. That is, this universe, this time, this epic of multiple crises simultaneously, because there is a scientific literature on this. I learned this in research for my book, All Hell Breaking Loose, which is specifically about the US military's response to climate change, but it bears on all of society's response, that there is a scientific literature on this kind of phenomenon that we're facing today. Of course, everybody thought this was going to happen far in the future, as you can imagine, 50 years, 100 years from now, but it's happening today. For example, I don't know how well this works, but in this heavy document, this is the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one of 4 volumes this thick, Climate Change 2014. They're now working on an update, but this one has on a page, has a whole section on the very end on tipping points or nonlinear events. And just read this. These are large-scale singular events, sometimes called tipping points or critical thresholds, are abrupt and drastic changes in physical, ecological, or social systems in response to smooth variations in driving forces, meaning it's not just an odd event, but we're in a new reality. Combined with widespread vulnerability and exposure, they pose risks because of the potential magnitude of the consequences, the rate at which they would occur, and depending on this rate, the limited ability of society to cope with them. So there is this scientific literature on tipping points, and what it shows is that a tipping point means you're not going back to where we were once before, where everything was hunky-dory. we're in a new reality where you have cascading events, compound events, where one shift leads to another, and that leads to another. And we are seeing this today, how a pandemic leads to an economic crisis, leads to a food crisis, leads to social and economic crises, and these have multiple feed-on effects. So this is the reality that we face. And as I say, we're going to see more of it. The predictions in these studies, in the scientific literature, tell us that out of this are likely to come mass migrations, more pandemics, social collapse, state collapse, war, ethnic violence, and so on. So how do we address this new reality? I think that's what we all need to be thinking about. How do we take our values, our history, our movements, and think about the future? And we're going to have to address multiple challenges simultaneously. Certainly everything we've done in the past is still valid. We still have to resist nuclear war. We still have to fight the Pentagon military spending. As Bob Moore said earlier, the things that you're doing as an organization are all true. We have to work on racial equality and all of those other issues. But I think we have to move beyond that and think about what are the core principles that are going to govern whatever we do, because we don't know what the next crisis is going to bring about. And if you look at the literature, some things stand out. And for those of you who want to pursue this, I want to recommend another book that I relied on. I don't know why it comes backwards in this, but it does. It's called Climate and Social Stress, Implications for Security Analysis, from the National Research Council. You can download this for free. It was prepared in 2013 for the US intelligence community, which means the CIA and the like. And it was an attempt to understand what climate change would mean for societies in the future under these multiple climate stresses and their implications. And out of this come some lessons. They looked at things like the response to Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy in New York City, and other such disasters. And some things stand out in all of these. And so 3 things emerge out of the literature of what the values that must be consistent in all of our responses. And there are 3 of them, and I want to mention these, and then we could have a conversation. The 3 things that stand out for societies that survive as against those that collapse. And it's not about wealth. It's not about whether you're in the global north or the global south or your religious orientation. The 3 things that ensure stability and survival are, first, social solidarity. That's a word. Do people come together in response to catastrophe, or are they divided amongst themselves? Societies that are able to create a sense of solidarity in response to crisis survive. Those that cannot bring themselves to work together in the face of catastrophe collapse. They fight amongst themselves and they and they all face disaster. This is the lesson of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and many other examples. The second is equity, perceived equity, especially equity in response to crisis. Now, we're seeing this in our country today. When emergency assistance, when aid, when help is provided in an equitable fashion to people in society, then you have social stability and the chance for renewal. When the assistance is provided in an inequitable fashion, then you have division and hostility among groups, anti-government anger, anger between groups, between those who are favored and those who are not. And we've seen in response to the pandemic economic meltdown in this society and in other countries around the world, those where emergency assistance is provided equitably, there's been a healthy response. And in places where there's a sense that the assistance is being provided inequitably, you have a feeling, including health assistance, you have a feeling of bitterness and resentment. And then one flare up and you see what happens. And that's what's happened in our society. And the third and final necessary condition is community resilience. Can your community cope with crisis and disaster and amongst its own resources, acquire the resources to address the calamity? And that means being prepared, having a community resilience system in place. And Danielle spoke about this earlier. I was very impressed in her presentation how when global food systems break down, as they have in this pandemic, being able to source food from nearby farms is absolutely critical. Being able to generate energy and water supplies and media and electricity locally is going to be critical. So developing community resiliency. So social stability, equity, resiliency, these are the values that every community will need to survive, no matter what the catastrophe we face in the future. And those will be the preconditions for peace going forward. And those are the thoughts that have been on my mind over the past weeks and months since I was asked to address this group, realizing that more needed to be said. And I hope I hope you found these thoughts useful and that we have some discussions, questions, and I'm ready for that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so let's jump into Q&A. We have a question from Ed. Did you want to just ask that, Ed?
Oh, let me see. Can you hear me okay? So, Michael, I really appreciate your talks. I followed your work for many years, going all the way back to the North American Congress for Latin America. And I really value the books you've written and the work you've done. And I appreciate, too, the principles that you've laid out in terms of equity and resiliency and so forth. In terms of the United States, however, let me try to narrow down a little bit the question of, we now have a climate task force, for example, that has been put together for the 2020 campaign led by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and John Kerry. And, it would be possible for this task force to simply kind of reiterate, we want to go back to the climate accord, the Paris Accords, and move a little beyond that. But I think we all know we need to do much more than that. So programmatically, in terms of what can be done in this country, I'm thinking of two things that I hope they can focus on, and I'm wondering what else you would also add to that. The first thing is conversion from military production to, a green economy. That is to say, production, whether it's additional production of solar and solar panels and wind turbines, but also things like green buildings. Cities and states can really work on green buildings. Yet we don't actually have to rely on the federal government. And the other thing is, we need the federal government to do it, but we can start with the cities and the states. And I guess the other thing is kind of the notion of going back to what Danielle was talking about. There's a lot of food insecurity in this country, and that may not be directly climate directed or related, but it is certainly related to the military budget. So how do we get the resources to the people who need it? With 40 million unemployed, a lot of people are actually going hungry. 30% of the children I read under 12 now have food insecurity. So I know there's a lot there, but what would be your top priorities for that task force?
Yeah, so you raise things that I would love to spend, the rest of the afternoon discussing. So hard to pin down things. My talk came out of a profound sense that we are at a time of profound change. And it's happening faster than any of us can, hold on to. And some of the issues that you raise are going to be not solved by, but will be beyond policy because they are happening so rapidly, beyond our control. So I think the first thing we ask is, how will the changes that are now happening going to affect the issues that you're discussing? And then we ask what government could do. That's in the background. So talking about energy and green energy, the post-COVID world is going to be very different than the pre-COVID world with respect to energy. And there's some things that that are going to happen by their own. The transition to green energy is going to happen faster in this new world, not because of anything that, not because of anything that policymakers do, but because of, changes in the world, changes in the global economy, changes in the way we behave. People are not going to be commuting to downtown cities as much anymore, for example. People are going to be not using cars as much, and they're not going to be flying as much in the new world. I sincerely believe that, even when all is said and done. I mean, we're going to be in a new world. So we have to ask what can government do to facilitate, to accelerate the processes that are already in motion. Coal is doomed in this new world. That's a good outcome of the COVID emergency. It's not all bad. Coal is, and also doomed is what's called unconventional oil and gas, expensive to tar sands, Arctic oil and gas. These will not survive because they're uneconomical. So what we have to do is eliminate those people like Donald Trump who wants to use government to subsidize, to perpetuate these doomed industries. Let's let capitalism prevail. Let market forces prevail. In a post-COVID market economy, coal has no future. Tar sands have no future. You know what I'm saying? So that's a good outcome. So government should facilitate the positive things that are happening. People are going to ride bicycles more to get to work. And so build more bike lanes, you know, make it easier for people to ride bikes. So facilitate the good and hinder the bad. That's my answer to that question. I could say much, much more, but look at how the world is changing and how we can accelerate the good changes and obstruct the bad changes.
You went exactly where I was hoping you would go, so thank you.
Yeah. There's more to say about food, but maybe I could come back to that if other people, I see there are other people want to ask questions.
Yeah, there are a couple more. Here's one from Deanna. In the 1960s, when scientists were the ones who told leaders the planet is getting warmer and that it's man-made, if leaders had listened to those scientists in the first place rather than lobbyists, would we have been able to avoid the crisis today?
Yes.
Simple answer.
I mean, it's a tragedy. What
Right.
can I say? It's a disgrace and a tragedy.
Right.
This is why government is so important, because it's not a matter of listening. It's a matter of government policy. And we had it in place in this country and in Russia and in China and in India. I hate it when people think this is just an American problem. We had in place in all of those countries governments that facilitated the perpetuation of fossil fuels and are continuing to do that today. And we have to get rid of governments that are beholden to the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, we have a couple questions that are related to the Department of Defense. Kip Marlowe is saying, I've heard the Department of Defense has shown courage in leading on climate change. Was that true before 2017? Is it still true? And then a couple questions about the military being a big consumer of petroleum products and the military budget as well.
Oh, these are all good questions. So I confess I've written a book on this topic. I already mentioned its name, All Hell Breaking Loose, and it's about the military's response to climate change. And I'll be very clear that the US military says that our first duty is to defend the nation, the United States, against our enemies, which, you know, change over time. Right now it's China, 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 Russia, North Korea, and Iran in that order. But they say we're no dummies. We have eyes that could see, and we see that climate change is making our job harder and harder and will get more difficult in the future. And therefore, we cannot do our duty. We cannot carry out our professional responsibility to defend the nation in a world of changing climate. And therefore, like it or not, we have to address the climate change problem. And so the US military actually has done some far-sighted thinking about the problem of climate change, beginning in 2010, starting then, calling on the armed forces to take steps to enhance their resiliency in the face of climate change, to reduce their carbon emissions, and to work with other countries to address climate change. Now, since Trump became president, they can't use that language, but they're still doing the same things of working on this issue. The US military is a major user of petroleum. They're cutting way back. I think they've cut back by a fourth or fifth, certainly by a fifth from where they were in 2000. So they're cutting back. it doesn't compare, they don't compare, say, if you combine all of the US airlines together pre-COVID, or UPS and FedEx consume much more petroleum in the United States than the military does, but it is a major consumer of petroleum. I don't know if that's answering all those questions. I love to talk about this, so people come back and ask me more questions.
There's a
About the defense budget, if people have specific questions about that, they could come back to me because I'm working on that now.
great. There's a few questions kind of focusing on our current situation in the United States and globally, with so much going on.
Mhm.
What gives you hope, and also what can give young people hope who might not necessarily be engaging in climate change because it's depressing or it feels so like such a big problem to be up against?
So, well, watching Danielle give her presentation gives me hope, okay? I hope she's still listening, or you could pass on to her that I found that very impressive. And the other young people who've shown leadership in the past days. On the issue of climate change, I think, as I said a little while ago, you know, I think the pandemic and the economic meltdown is good for reducing the climate threat. That may be the one good outcome of the pandemic. Maybe the only good outcome, but I think it's going to slow down warming, and it's going to accelerate the transition to green energy. I'm pretty confident of that. So that's something that's a little bit hopeful. I also think that the explosion, the global explosion in response to the murder of George Floyd, I think emphasized the values that I was speaking to of social solidarity and equity and community resilience. All three of them, I think, have been factors. You could see that in all of the protests. And as I say, those are going to be essential to survival on a warmer planet. And I think that people are getting much smarter about these things, especially younger people. So that gives me hope.
We do have one question that is specific about Pentagon budget that's come in, that Bernie Sanders has proposed a 10% cut to the Pentagon budget to move $74 million to human needs. What is your reaction to this proposal?
So now, that's a good question. This is again something where we may not have to do a whole lot to see stuff like this happen. Now, but no, I'll take that back. I mean, we're all going to have to weigh in. Right now, the Senate and the House Armed Services Committee are debating the fiscal year 2021 defense budget, and the Senate is controlled by Republicans. So they're going to push through a $700 billion plus defense budget, come what may. In the House, it's controlled by the Democrats, and the Democrats, many of them, this is in the House, Bernie is in the Senate. In the House, many of them are saying that given the crisis we face in this country, we should reduce defense spending. And you have competing pressures. You also have the head of the Federal Reserve and other top economists saying that we're far from out of the woods on the economic consequences of the pandemic. It's not going to be a fast recovery. In fact, we could have a significant depression for years to come, and that therefore we need more federal spending, more federal assistance to the states in particular, to municipalities, to schools, to businesses. And at some point, you know, people are saying in Washington, conservatives, Republicans, we can't have both. We can't keep printing money. And so there is going to be pressure to reduce the defense budget, not because Bernie Sanders or, you know, people say, but because we need that money to keep the economy afloat. So we should support that. We should support all these efforts to cut the defense budget for whatever reason. Hope that makes sense.
Right. Thank you. I definitely agree with that. I think at this point I might hand it back to Bob to give us a little wrap up.
Can I just say one more thing?
Of course.
There are some very specific things that people have to weigh in now. Now I can make a pitch. Nikki, you said nice things about me when you introduced me. I'm no longer teaching at Hampshire College. I retired, and now I work as a volunteer at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C. On the issues that Bob raised. And there are a couple of things that are pressing in the next couple of weeks as the Senate and the House mark up the defense budget. One of them is nuclear testing. Those I don't want to use nasty language, but they want to put in money to resume nuclear testing. So, Senator Markey in the Senate, with Bernie Sanders' support and others, have introduced an amendment to ban prohibit the use of federal funds for nuclear testing. So everybody who's listening should write a letter or send a call to their senator and House member. There's a House version. This has to be done now, in the next week, and tell everybody to support the Markey bill, no funds for nuclear testing. And the other thing is they want to have the biggest buildup since the Cold War for nuclear weapons spending to modernize the entire nuclear arsenal. And those funds are going to be voted on in the next 2 weeks. So in the same letter, say no new funds for nuclear weapons.
Thank you so much for those actionable items.
Thank you.
Shall I jump in now, Nikki?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Well, I first want to thank Professor Klare. I thought that was really an outstanding presentation, and I admired you for a long time, going back to my days when I was National Secretary of Mobilization for Survival, starting in 1978. So I remember your great leadership even then, Michael. And I was intrigued that one of your comments actually reminded me of Freeman Dyson, who died not long ago, but a great supporter of ours and a sponsor. And in his book on Weapons and Hope, he made a similar argument that half of the military was actually on our side in terms of opposing nuclear weapons. And in fact, he said that those were the Army and the Marine Corps, and they don't have any use for nuclear weapons. So that's a very good, intriguing argument to say, are there new allies that we might be able to work with? I will address what you commented on about nuclear testing in a moment, but first I want to just mention another juncture where I was really impressed with the visionary engagement of Professor Klare, which was after 9/11, And as you know, we were rushed into a war which turned out to be a illegitimate and totally unnecessary war against Iraq. And Michael Klare was out there immediately after the attack of 9/11 saying we should approach this through international criminal justice mechanisms. That is to say, these were thugs who committed a crime. They should be pursued through the legal mechanisms of the international community. They should be arrested and brought to justice, but war made no sense as a means of opposing terrorism. That was really visionary, and would that more of us would have taken that to heart, our country. Let me just say as well that the issue you raised were in close touch with some of our here at Princeton University. I'm sure you probably know some of them. Professor Klare is Professor Franklin Hippel, Dr. Zia Mian, among them. And so they immediately brought the Markey bill to our attention, and we're working closely with them. And in fact, I mentioned our virtual appointments, and we're scheduling one for this week with Senator Menendez's office, because he is the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. So we're on that. We're going to be all of you on this webinar. I hope you'll stay alert. We're going to be sending you a e-alert about it in the near future. And it's something that we need to grab on and try to stop, because this is yet another treaty that Trump is intent on taking the wrecking ball to. Now, the treaty was never ratified, some of you know, by the US Senate. But it was an intriguing way that implementation got started back in 1992, when the first George Bush was still president and running for re-election. He very much felt that he needed the super collider in Texas as to be approved for the funding of it in order to enhance his prospects for re-election. So the Senate used its purse string power to attach a resolution that required a U.S. nuclear testing moratorium. That's how the U.S. nuclear testing moratorium, which is in law still today. So Trump would be again in violation of law if he were to resume nuclear testing. So Congress can really use its clout, and needs to at this time, to prevent and stop any resumption of U.S. nuclear testing. That would be one of the worst possible developments. We're already reeling from this wrecking ball approach. So I just am so grateful for your vision. One of the first things I'm going to do when this webinar is over is order your new book, Michael, because you have such great insights and you weave all these things together. We are going to continue to pursue our intersectional work with the climate crisis movement. I agree with you completely that these are the twin threats to human existence. We all have an obligation to ourselves, but also to future generations, to do our very best to link them and to seek to stop both these threats from taking down the human community. One final sort of little bit downbeat, I don't mean to end on a downbeat note, but Professor Klare was mentioning about the probability of nuclear war being raised because of the climate issues, is particularly relating to water in India and Pakistan. The International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War brought together experts a few years ago to look at what would happen in a nuclear war where only half the arsenal of each India and Pakistan was used. They each have about 100 nuclear bombs. So this was thinking if each used half of its arsenal for a total of 100 nuclear explosions in India and Pakistan. And the outcome of what they said is that an estimated 2 billion human beings, close to 1/3 of humanity, would die from the use of that tiny fraction of the 12,000 nuclear weapons that still exist today. Just 100 of those exploding would cause massive starvation because of nuclear winter. And so these are truly existential crises. They're both speeding toward getting worse. And so we need to stick together. We need your support. We need your involvement more than ever. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, for hearing these excellent talks and the presentations to our honorees. I hope I'll see some of you again later today at 7:30 in Cranberry, but stay involved with us. Support us in whatever way you can, because it's only by strengthening our efforts together that we as a team can tackle these very daunting challenges indeed. There is hope. There is hope because of people like Danielle. There's hope because of other young women that are taking leadership on the Black Lives Matter. There is hope because we're still working, even some of us well up in years. We're still working on these issues. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for your support. Have a good rest of your day, and please stay tuned and stay involved. Take care.
Thanks, Bob.